Welcome, everyone, to Moderation's Call Wisdom for Wealth and Power. I'm Elliot, and today we're diving into a really thought provoking topic. We'll be exploring spiritual traditions and their timeless warnings against excess, while also promoting the profound importance of kindness in our lives. Our central debate question for today is: can wealth and power truly align with spiritual wisdom, or do they inherently lead to insatiable desires and excess? We'll start with opening remarks from our debaters, move into a discussion, then rebuttals, and finally our conclusions. Joining us today are two insightful voices. First, we have Thomas, who will argue for the potential positive role of wealth and power in driving progress and creating positive platforms. And then we have Sophie, who will highlight the spiritual perspective on excess, drawing on concepts like the hungry ghost metaphor to illustrate the dangers of insatiable desires. This topic is incredibly relevant today, especially for young learners and students navigating a world that often values ambition and material success. Understanding these different perspectives can help us all think more critically about our own values. So, without further ado, to highlight the spiritual perspective on excess, could you start by elaborating on what spiritual traditions universally warn us about when it comes to wealth and power?
Absolutely, Elliot. It's fascinating how consistent spiritual traditions are across cultures and time. They all, without exception, caution against the dangers of excessive wealth and power. It's often viewed as a kind of addiction where individuals become unable to stop striving for more, even when it causes misery to themselves or others.
Sophie, I understand the historical warnings, but isn't it a bit simplistic to label all pursuit of wealth or power as an addiction? Surely there's a distinction between ambition and destructive excess.
That's a fair point, Thomas. The distinction lies in the insatiability of the desire. Spiritual teaching suggests that when the pursuit becomes endless, when enough is never enough, that's when it crosses into excess. It's not about having wealth, but about being consumed by the desire for more.
So, Sophie, you're saying it's the endless craving, not the possession itself, that's the issue. And you mentioned the hungry ghost metaphor earlier. Can you explain what that means and how it relates to this idea of insatiable desires?
Of course. The hungry ghost is a powerful metaphor found in some Eastern spiritual traditions. It describes a being with a huge, empty stomach, but a tiny, constricted throat. No matter how much it tries to eat, it can never be satisfied. It's a perfect illustration of insatiable desires. This metaphor highlights how individuals consumed by excess often fail to recognize even basic needs, not just for themselves, but for society. They might overlook the importance of clean air, fresh water, or a safe environment because their focus is solely on accumulating more.
I see the metaphor's point about insatiability, Sophie, but in a modern context, isn't ambition often a driving force for innovation and progress? How do we reconcile these ancient warnings with the need for growth and development in our societies? It seems like the spiritual perspective might sometimes be at odds with the practicalities of building a thriving economy or leading effectively.
That's a crucial question, Thomas. So, we have the spiritual warnings against insatiable desires, exemplified by the hungry ghost, but also the modern reality of ambition driving progress. Sophie, how do spiritual traditions offer a counterbalance to this potential for excess, especially in today's world?
They advocate for moderation, Elliot. These aren't just abstract ideals, they're practical counterbalances. Moderation encourages us to find a healthy balance, to recognize when enough is enough, and to appreciate what we have. Kindness, on the other hand, shifts our focus from purely self serving accumulation to considering the well being of others and the environment. It fosters a sense of stewardship, reminding us that we're interconnected and have a responsibility to share resources and protect our planet.
I agree that moderation and kindness are vital, Sophie, and I think that's where my point about positive platforms comes in. If we channel ambition towards creating systems that promote environmental stewardship, health, and diplomacy, rather than just military expansion or unchecked growth, then wealth and power can be forces for good. It's about the direction of that ambition, not necessarily its existence. We can strive for more, but for the benefit of all, not just a few.
I appreciate that perspective, Thomas. The intention behind the ambition is indeed critical. However, the spiritual warnings suggest that even with good intentions, the nature of excessive accumulation can inherently lead to a detachment from those very values of kindness and stewardship. It's a constant struggle to maintain that balance when the drive for more becomes all consuming.
That's a really insightful point, Sophie. So it's not just about what you do with wealth and power, but also the internal state and the potential for the pursuit itself to corrupt. Thomas, do you see a way to integrate these spiritual warnings into modern political and economic structures without stifling innovation?
I think it requires a fundamental shift in how we define success. Instead of purely material metrics, we need to value societal well being, environmental health, and equitable distribution. Political platforms that prioritize these values can guide ambition towards constructive ends. It's about creating a framework where moderation and kindness are incentivized, rather than just left to individual conscience.
And that, Thomas, aligns perfectly with the spiritual call for a collective consciousness that recognizes our shared humanity and our responsibility to the planet. It's about moving beyond the hungry ghost mentality to a more holistic view of prosperity.
That's a powerful connection, Sophie. So, if we're moving towards a more holistic view of prosperity, how does this hungry ghost mentality, this addiction to more, directly impact our collective well being, especially when it comes to those fundamental, basic necessities?
Well, Elliot, the hungry ghost mentality often leads to a profound neglect of what's truly essential. Individuals and, by extension, societies consumed by this insatiable desire for wealth and power can overlook universal rights to things like clean air, fresh water, and a safe environment. Their focus is so narrow on accumulation that they miss the bigger picture of environmental stewardship and basic human needs.
I understand the concern about neglecting essential needs, Sophie, and I agree that environmental health is paramount. But I wonder if it's always an addiction in the clinical sense, or if it's sometimes a misdirection of ambition. Couldn't the drive for innovation, even if it's for profit, sometimes lead to solutions for these very environmental problems?
That's a fair distinction, Thomas. So, Sophie highlights how the hungry ghost can lead to neglecting basic needs, while Thomas suggests ambition could be redirected. This brings us to a crucial point. How does this addiction to wealth and power manifest in our political and social systems? Are we seeing this play out in how our leaders operate?
Absolutely, Elliot. When you look at current political systems, they often seem to be driven by a similar insatiable desire for power. The focus frequently shifts to opposition and gaining control, rather than genuinely constructive platforms that address the well being of citizens or the planet. It's a constant striving for dominance rather than collaboration for common good.
I agree that political systems can become overly focused on opposition, Sophie. It's frustrating. I think we need candidates who clearly articulate what they support, like environmental health, access to nutritious food, and mental and physical well being for all. That's a constructive platform, and it channels ambition towards positive societal outcomes rather than just a power struggle.
So, we're seeing a parallel between individual insatiability and systemic political issues. Sophie, you mentioned earlier that spiritual traditions have warned against this for millennia. Can you elaborate on the historical evidence of the devastation caused by such excesses?
Certainly. History is unfortunately replete with examples. Over thousands of years, we've seen empires rise and fall due to the unchecked pursuit of wealth and power, leading to exploitation, conflict, and environmental degradation. Every major spiritual tradition, from Buddhism to Christianity, has warned against these excesses because they've witnessed the misery they cause, not just to individuals, but to entire civilizations.
The historical warnings are undeniable, Sophie, but I believe modern societies have the capacity to learn from those lessons. We can choose to prioritize diplomacy and infrastructure stewardship over military expansion, for instance. It's about consciously designing systems that guide our collective ambition towards sustainable growth and shared prosperity, rather than repeating past mistakes.
That's a hopeful perspective, Thomas. So, we have these ancient warnings and historical evidence of devastation, but also the potential for modern systems to adapt. Sophie, how do we practically shift from this hungry ghost mentality, this addiction, to a more holistic view of prosperity that truly values societal well being and environmental health?
It requires a fundamental shift in our political and economic structures, Elliot. We need to move beyond simply individual moderation and encourage policies that actively prioritize these values. It means redefining success not just by GDP, but by the health of our communities, our environment, and the well being of all citizens. It's a collective awakening.
I completely agree, Sophie. It's about creating a framework where moderation and kindness are not just personal virtues, but are incentivized and built into our systems. When we elect leaders who champion these values, and when our economic models reward sustainable practices, that's when we can truly channel ambition for the benefit of everyone, moving beyond that insatiable drive.
That's a powerful vision for change. So, to summarize this segment, we've explored how the addiction to wealth and power, exemplified by the hungry ghost mentality, can lead to neglecting basic needs and fuel destructive political systems. But we've also discussed the potential for a conscious shift towards holistic prosperity, where moderation, kindness, and a redefinition of success can guide our collective ambition. Thank you both for this insightful discussion. Building on that, if the hungry ghost mentality truly blinds us to basic needs, how does this manifest in the priorities our societies set? For instance, what gets funded and what gets neglected when this insatiable drive for more takes hold?
That's a crucial question, Elliot. When the hungry ghost mentality dominates, we often see a profound misallocation of resources. Instead of investing in clean air, fresh water, or robust public health systems, the focus shifts to things that fuel further accumulation or power, like military expansion or industries that prioritize profit over planetary health. It's a neglect of the fundamental rights of all to essential resources.
I agree that priorities can get skewed, Sophie, and the neglect of environmental stewardship is a serious concern. However, I think it's also about how we pursue growth. If we channel ambition towards developing sustainable technologies or building resilient infrastructure, that's still a form of progress that benefits everyone. It's not necessarily about less, but about smarter, more ethical growth.
So, Sophie, you're highlighting how the hungry ghost can lead to a societal neglect of basic needs and environmental stewardship, while Thomas suggests that ambition can be redirected towards constructive, sustainable growth. This brings us to the long term. What are the ultimate societal consequences if this hungry ghost mentality persists unchecked?
If this insatiable desire for more continues to dictate our societal priorities, the consequences are dire. We risk irreversible environmental degradation, widening social inequalities, and a constant state of conflict over diminishing resources. History and spiritual traditions warn us that this path ultimately leads to societal breakdown and widespread suffering because it ignores our interconnectedness.
I share the concern about those potential outcomes, Sophie, but I don't believe they're inevitable. We have the capacity for conscious choice. By promoting health, investing in infrastructure stewardship, and prioritizing diplomacy over military expansion, we can actively steer away from those destructive paths. It requires a collective will, but it's absolutely achievable.
You both present compelling arguments about the potential future. Sophie, you paint a stark picture of decline if the hungry ghost persists, while Thomas offers a more hopeful vision of redirection. How do we practically make this shift? What specific actions or changes are needed to move towards a more holistic society that truly values collective well-being?
It starts with a fundamental reevaluation of what we value. We need to shift from valuing endless accumulation to valuing clean air, clean water, nutritious food, and overall health for both body and mind. This means encouraging societal frameworks that prioritize sustainable practices and collective well being, making these the cornerstones of our policies and economies.
Exactly. And that translates into concrete political and economic choices. We need to elect leaders who champion these values, who articulate what they support, like robust public health initiatives and green infrastructure, rather than just what they oppose. It's about creating systems where moderation and kindness are incentivized, not just personal virtues.
So, the shift involves both a redefinition of societal values and concrete policy changes. But beyond leaders and policies, what role do individuals play in countering this hungry ghost pull? How can everyday people contribute to this shift towards a more holistic view of prosperity?
Individual choices are incredibly powerful, Elliot. Practicing moderation in our consumption, choosing kindness in our interactions, and being mindful of our impact on the environment all contribute. When enough individuals make these choices, it creates a ripple effect, building a collective consciousness that can genuinely challenge the hungry ghost mentality.
I agree, Sophie. It's about conscious consumerism, supporting businesses that align with these values, and advocating for change in our communities. When individuals demand better, it creates pressure on systems to adapt. It's not just about personal restraint, but about actively participating in shaping a more responsible and sustainable society.
That's a powerful call to action for our listeners. So, as we wrap up this segment, I want to ask a final overarching question. Given the deep seated nature of human desires, is it truly possible to overcome this hungry ghost tendency? Or is it an inherent human challenge that we can only ever manage rather than fully conquer?
I believe it's a continuous journey, Elliot. Spiritual traditions don't promise a complete eradication of desire, but rather a path to understanding and managing it. The hungry ghost will always be a potential within us, but through wisdom, moderation, and kindness, we can prevent it from consuming us and our societies. It requires constant vigilance and collective effort.
I'm more optimistic, Sophie. I think humanity has a remarkable capacity for evolution and learning. While the drive for more might be inherent, our ability to reason, empathize, and design better systems means we can absolutely move beyond the destructive aspects of the hungry ghost. We can redefine what more means, making it about more well being, more sustainability, and more shared prosperity.
That's a hopeful note to end on for this segment. So, we've explored the profound implications of the hungry ghost mentality, from its impact on societal priorities and potential long term consequences, to the practical steps and individual actions needed to foster a more holistic and sustainable future. Thank you both for this incredibly insightful discussion on Moderation's Call. Welcome back to Moderation's Call. We've just heard Sophie's compelling arguments about the dangers of excessive wealth and power, drawing on spiritual traditions and the hungry ghost metaphor. Now, Thomas, you're here to present a counterpoint. How can wealth and power actually drive progress and create positive platforms in our societies?
Thank you, Elliot. I think it's crucial to distinguish between destructive excess and ambition channeled for good. Wealth and power aren't inherently negative. When directed with intention, they can fund critical infrastructure, advance scientific research, and support philanthropic endeavors that genuinely lift communities and address global challenges.
I agree that resources can be used for good, Thomas. However, the spiritual warnings aren't just about the use of wealth, but the desire for it. How do we ensure that the pursuit of power for these positive platforms doesn't become an end in itself, leading to the very insatiable desire and excess we're warned against?
That's the core tension, isn't it? The potential for good versus the inherent risk of insatiable desire. Thomas, can you give us some concrete examples where significant wealth or power has undeniably led to widespread progress without falling into that trap of excess?
Certainly. Think about the large scale investments in renewable energy technologies or global health initiatives that eradicate diseases. These require immense capital and coordinated power, often from governments or wealthy philanthropists, to achieve widespread impact that benefits millions, even billions of people.
Those are indeed impactful projects, Thomas. But even in those cases, we often see debates about who truly benefits, or if the methods used to accumulate that wealth in the first place were entirely ethical. The hungry ghost can be subtle, manifesting as a desire for control or influence, even within seemingly benevolent projects.
So, Sophie, you're suggesting that even when the outcome appears positive, the process or the underlying motivation might still be problematic from a spiritual perspective. Thomas, how do we reconcile this? Is it about the nature of wealth and power itself, or the ethical framework and intent behind its application?
I believe it's fundamentally about the framework and intent. If we have strong governance, transparency, and a collective commitment to stewardship for air, water, and land, as the source content mentions, then wealth and power become tools for good, not ends in themselves. It's about prioritizing positive agendas.
While I appreciate the call for strong frameworks, Thomas, spiritual traditions often highlight that external rules are insufficient if the internal hungry ghost remains unchecked. The temptation for more can always find loopholes or corrupt systems from within, regardless of initial good intentions.
That's a profound point, Sophie. It brings us back to the internal struggle. Thomas, how do you propose we build systems that are resilient against this hungry ghost tendency, especially when we're talking about large scale progress that often requires significant power?
It starts with electing leaders who genuinely prioritize positive agendas, as I mentioned earlier. Leaders focused on environmental protection, health promotion, and infrastructure stewardship. And it means shifting investment from military to diplomacy and health, which is a direct quote from our source material.
I agree with the shift towards diplomacy and health, Thomas. That's a positive direction. However, the spiritual warning is that even well intentioned leaders can be swayed by the allure of power once they possess it. It's a constant battle against the self serving impulse, which history has shown us repeatedly.
So, Sophie, is there any scenario where spiritual wisdom would actively endorse the accumulation of resources, perhaps for a collective good, without seeing it as inherently problematic?
Many traditions speak of right livelihood and generosity. If wealth is acquired ethically and used for the genuine upliftment of all, with no attachment to the outcome or the status it brings, then it can be seen as a form of service. But that detachment is incredibly difficult to maintain in practice.
And that's precisely the kind of positive platform I'm advocating for, Sophie. Using resources to build a better world, not just for personal gain. It's about conscious, ethical leadership and a societal commitment to shared prosperity, where the focus is on the well being of all.
This has been a truly insightful discussion. We've explored how wealth and power can be powerful engines for progress, from infrastructure to global health, but also the critical spiritual warnings about the hungry ghost and the constant need for moderation, ethical frameworks, and a redefinition of success. Thank you both for shedding light on this complex balance. Welcome back to Moderation's Call. We've just wrapped up a really thought provoking discussion on the hungry ghost mentality and its impact. Now, let's pivot to a more proactive approach. Thomas, you've often spoken about the potential for positive political platforms. How do we translate this holistic vision of prosperity into concrete political action?
Thanks, Elliot. I think it starts with a fundamental shift in political discourse. Instead of constantly focusing on opposition, we need candidates to present platforms that clearly articulate what they support. We need to hear about tangible commitments.
I agree with the sentiment, Thomas. It's refreshing to imagine a political landscape focused on positive change. But given the historical tendency for power to corrupt, how do we ensure these positive platforms don't just become another means to an insatiable end, another form of the hungry ghost?
That's a fair challenge, Sophie. But I believe it's about the content of the platform and the intent behind it. We're talking about platforms that prioritize things like cleaner air and water, promoting nutritious food and health, and robust infrastructure stewardship. These are collective goods, not personal gains.
So, Thomas, you're suggesting that by focusing on these specific, universally beneficial goals, the ambition itself becomes less about personal power and more about collective well being. Can you elaborate on what else these positive platforms might include?
Absolutely. Beyond environmental and health initiatives, we need to see a strong diplomatic core, comparable to the investment we put into our military. It's about fostering peace and collaboration globally, rather than just preparing for conflict. This is a direct quote from the source material, and it's a crucial reprioritization.
I wholeheartedly support the idea of a stronger diplomatic corps, Thomas. That aligns perfectly with spiritual teachings on interconnectedness and peaceful coexistence. However, the challenge remains. How do we ensure leaders genuinely commit to these ideals when the political system often rewards adversarial tactics and short term power grabs?
It requires a societal commitment, Sophie. It's about citizens demanding this kind of leadership. When we elect leaders who champion these values, and when our economic models reward sustainable practices, that's when we can truly channel ambition for the benefit of everyone, moving beyond that insatiable drive.
That's a powerful point, Thomas. So it's not just about the leaders, but also the collective will of the people to demand and support these positive agendas. Sophie, from a spiritual perspective, how can we cultivate this collective consciousness that prioritizes stewardship and basic rights for all rather than just individual accumulation?
It begins with recognizing our shared humanity and our responsibility to the planet. Spiritual traditions emphasize that true prosperity isn't measured by individual wealth, but by the well being of the entire community and the health of the environment. It's about moving beyond the hungry ghost mentality to a more holistic view of success.
And that holistic view translates directly into policy. It means advocating for a societal commitment to ensuring basic rights, like food and shelter for all. These aren't radical ideas, they're fundamental to a just and thriving society, and they should be at the core of any positive political platform.
I agree, Thomas. When we talk about basic rights, we're talking about the very foundation of human dignity. Neglecting these, as the hungry ghost mentality often does, leads to widespread suffering and ultimately harms everyone, even those at the top.
So, we're talking about a shift from adversarial politics to constructive, solution oriented leadership, as our source content suggests. Thomas, what's the biggest hurdle you see in making this shift a reality in today's political climate?
Honestly, the biggest hurdle is the ingrained habit of focusing on what we're against rather than what we're for. It's easier to rally support by demonizing an opponent than by building consensus around complex positive solutions. We need to break that cycle.
And that cycle, Thomas, is often fueled by the very insatiable desire for power that spiritual traditions warn against. When the goal is simply to win rather than to serve, the focus inevitably shifts to opposition and control.
That's a crucial insight, Sophie. It brings us back to the internal motivations driving external actions. So, to summarize this segment, we've explored the urgent call for positive political platforms that prioritize collective well being, environmental stewardship, and diplomacy. We've discussed how this requires a shift from adversarial politics to constructive leadership, driven by a collective consciousness that values moderation and kindness. Thank you both for this insightful discussion. This has been an incredibly rich and nuanced discussion. We've explored so many facets of wealth, power, and spiritual wisdom. Now, as we approach the end of our debate, I'd like to invite each of you to offer your closing remarks, summarizing your strongest arguments, and leaving our audience with a final thought or question. Thomas, let's start with you.
Thank you, Elliot. My core argument is that wealth and power, when consciously directed, are not inherently negative. They are powerful tools that can drive immense progress, funding crucial infrastructure, advancing scientific research, and creating positive platforms for environmental stewardship, health, and diplomacy. It's about the direction of our ambition, not its mere existence. We have the capacity to design systems that incentivize moderation and kindness, moving beyond past mistakes to build a future of shared prosperity. My question for our listeners is, how can we, as individuals and communities, actively demand and support leaders and systems that prioritize collective well-being over unchecked accumulation?
A very clear call to action, Thomas. Sophie, what are your closing thoughts?
Thank you, Elliot. Spiritual traditions across millennia consistently warn us about the hungry ghost mentality, the insatiable desire for more wealth and power. This unchecked craving leads to a profound neglect of basic needs, environmental degradation, and ultimately, societal breakdown. Moderation and kindness are not just ideals, they are essential counterbalances that foster interconnectedness and prevent widespread suffering. Understanding these ancient warnings helps us recognize the internal struggle and the systemic dangers of excess. I'd like to ask our audience, in our daily lives, how can we cultivate a deeper sense of enough and prioritize genuine well being for ourselves and others, rather than constantly striving for external validation or material gain?
Both of you have presented such compelling and thoughtful perspectives. Thomas, you've highlighted the potential for wealth and power to be forces for good, emphasizing our capacity to consciously steer ambition towards positive platforms. Sophie, you've powerfully reminded us of the spiritual warnings against insatiable desires, urging us to cultivate moderation and kindness to avoid the pitfalls of the hungry ghost mentality. While you've approached this from different angles, there's a clear shared concern for societal well-being, environmental health, and a shift towards more constructive, less adversarial systems. To our young learners and students listening, I encourage you to reflect on these ideas. How do these perspectives resonate with your own experiences and observations? What kind of world do you want to build, and what values will guide your ambition? Thank you, Thomas and Sophie, for this incredibly insightful and thought-provoking discussion. And thank you, our listeners, for joining us on Moderation's Call, Wisdom for Wealth and Power. We hope this conversation sparks further critical thinking and inspires you to explore these vital topics more deeply. Until next time.